Hello, good evening. Tonight, a storm is raging over one of the world's most influential news institutions, the BBC. As Donald Trump wages a legal and political war against the broadcaster, critics say the BBC is struggling with declining funding, management turmoil, and rising pressure from governments at home and abroad. Supporters warn that if the BBC falls, the world could lose one of its last trusted shields against propaganda and disinformation. So, is this a crisis of accountability or an attempt to intimidate the press into silence? We explore tonight how the BBC became a battleground for power, truth, and public trust. I'm Mark Summers, and this is In Focus. The BBC, a global icon of storytelling and public service journalism, finds itself once again on the battlefield of power, politics, and public trust. According to Foreign Policy News, Donald Trump's latest offensive against the British broadcaster has triggered one of its deepest crises yet, tapping into long-standing criticisms about bias, mismanagement, and declining morale. Trump supporters claim the BBC is anti-Israel, pro-woke, and intentionally distorts facts, pointing to a Panorama documentary they say spliced his words to imply a call for violence on January 6th. But beyond the political theatrics lies a more structural threat. The BBC's funding model is eroding, its staff is shrinking, and governments, past and present, exploit its vulnerabilities. Its struggle to remain fiercely independent while constantly negotiating its future with political powers now raises a fundamental question. If the world loses the BBC's trusted reporting, who benefits and what replaces it? Our first guest tonight is joining us from London and is an economist and a political researcher, Babak Imamian. Thank you very much for being here with us on Q News. So what do you make of Trump's escalating legal and political pressure on the BBC?
Well, thank you for your question, Mark. First of all, this is a crisis, as you mentioned, is a crisis of credibility. BBC's credibility has been damaged. It is under attack. The question is how much more of it BBC can take, because if this case would go to trial, definitely would go to trial. The reason why it would go because the present management in BBC has no power or authority to settle, because as you said, BBC is publicly funded. So it will have to court. During the court procedures, as President Trump has said, there will be many more people who would come and make similar claims against BBC, being unbiased and not presenting the report honestly. We already know in case of President Trump, the Newsnight program, there's already one, and there are also several which are coming up. So then during the trial, in the next 3 months or 4 months or 6 months, more would come. The new management then would come and say, this is publicly funded institution, but we need now to settle this case. And they would eventually settle, because I don't see BBC being able to take more damage to its credibility.
And the BBC has apologized to Donald Trump. What had happened on January the 6th, he'd made a speech and they'd edited 2 parts of the speech, which are an hour apart, in a documentary which aired just before the American election. The BBC apologized, but says that it only aired in Britain, so it could not have had any effect on the election. Also, Trump won that election. Despite that, Trump is asking for damages of between $1 billion and $5 billion. As you mentioned, the BBC is paid for by taxes, by a a tax that everyone has to pay in Britain. So he's basically asking $5 billion from the British taxpayer, is he not?
Absolutely right. And the excuses the BBC are putting forward, which I understand, they have to do it at this stage. It's like a bank robber saying that I only robbed bank in Italy, so I cannot be prosecuted in Britain. And that's their defense right now. It was a dishonest. They were saying that President Trump was calling for violence, which is a big accusation, big accusation. And right now, President Trump is very angry. And the reason why he cannot let go of this case is because if he does let go of this challenge to BBC, then they cannot challenge the other news media in future. So the question is the conversation between President Trump and Keir Starmer. Would the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, would be asking President Trump to drop this case? And would that be a wise approach to ask President Trump to drop this case? Because I cannot see President Trump wanting to drop this case or would drop this case for his own strategy.
I mean, he'd be wanting something at least in return, I would imagine. I mean, he's tried this on various networks in the United States, and many of them have capitulated and paid him out money. Nowhere near this amount of money, $1 billion, which he's asking of the BBC. Is there anything you think that Keir Starmer could offer Donald Trump that would make him back down?
Well, first of all, the money is not, the amount of money is not the question. Is the payment of the money is just confirmation that there was malice there. It was something very wrong. So that's the amount, whether it'll be 15 or 16 million dollars as he has paid previously to other news media, which most probably would be the settlement around that much. And this 1 billion is just to get more attention towards BBC, and 5 billion even to get more BBC of what is happening, this attack on BBC. So again, I would say the BBC has to settle this as soon as possible. BBC right now is saying we are strong enough, we could stand up to President Trump. They could if they were honest on this. But then if more allegation comes up, more cases comes up, and we know already about other cases, it's all over. And then there will be more whistleblowers, and then most disgruntled employees coming up with more even facts about BBC being unbiased and not reporting honestly. So can BBC take that risk? And again, the question is, what could Keir Starmer, who is a weak prime minister right now, his own survival is not clear, whether he would survive in the next 6 months or a year or so, after the 26th of November when the budget will come out. So there are all these issues. So I hope that Keir Starmer would interfere and settle this case somehow, and there has to be some payments.
You mentioned there other accusations of bias that the BBC has been accused of. In the same report, they were accused of being anti-Israel in another program. They also regularly get accused of being anti-Palestine as well. The report the article that I mentioned and referenced just a little while ago says that the BBC is in permanent nervous breakdown. Why do you think the BBC has become so fragile?
Well, we all believe in freedom of expression, but then even freedom of expression has its own limit. You cannot make false allegations against people. You cannot intimidate people. You cannot insult people. You cannot defame people. But somehow recently, in the last 10 years, especially since President Trump first term, all this has gone out. There is no accountability on the media. It seems like an open field to start defaming people, insulting people, intimidating people. So now I think a return of accountability, even for journalists, it's a good thing for the public.
But do you think that perhaps institutions like the BBC, perhaps the New York Times, which often come into Trump's eye line or for criticism, are kind of held to a higher standard. When they do make mistakes, they apologize for them. There are other outlets and other media that don't and perpetuate untruths as a matter of course.
Well, I would say it's nothing to do with whether New York Times or BBC or other medias. Most of them are on left of politics. Generally, most journalists and people in the media are on left of politics, which is there is nothing wrong with it as long as they report honestly. But there is that unnecessary hostility towards President Trump, which is not, he cannot explain it, why there is so much hostility towards President Trump. And that actually reflects in the reporting, which most of them, even if they want to report honestly, they cannot report honestly. And we've seen that all the time. And even now, you see it with BBC, the way they are, instead of sincerely apologizing, they're just saying it was a mistake. This has never happened before. We are credible. We are the best in the world. Which is not the case. This self-congratulations is not a good thing for any institution.
But when journalists are attacked, and Trump has made a career, some might say, of attacking and trying to silence journalists, and when lawsuits for a lot of money, when media organizations, not just the BBC, but all over the world, are struggling, might that lead to self-censorship on the part of journalists?
This self-censorship is a joke. There is no censorship. Self-censorship it's like open field that, as I said, they can insult anybody, intimidate anyone, defame anybody. And the only reason why President Trump can defend himself, because average person in public cannot defend themselves. We've seen that many times, even in Britain, in United Kingdom, with many cases. And it just takes strong individuals, very strong individuals like President Trump, who can take on the media. And he's done it, and he's doing it, and he's made a mission out of it. So he's actually doing a public service by making news media's journalists accountable one more time to the public.
Now, you live in the UK, of course, and will take in, I would imagine, British media. The law, the rules in Britain, in broadcast media, in television, radio media, is that in news you must give both sides of the story. So in Gaza and Israel, you must give both sides equal weight. Do you see, it's called impartiality, do you put any weight behind the idea of impartiality, which is not the case in the United States?
Mark, you missed the word honestly. You said both sides of the story, but both sides of the story have to be reported honestly. So what's the point of both sides of the story are reported, but it is dishonest reporting. So this is what I think is missing right now, that inherent honesty. Of course, you are a fantastic journalist. You are a very honest journalist. That's why we are having this discussion. But I can say many of your colleagues, especially in United Kingdom and in part of America, are very dishonest when it comes to reporting.
And what about the way the BBC is funded by taxpayers? They call it the license fee. Everybody who has a television must pay it. Can you see when there's the likes of Netflix out there and streaming services, could you see the BBC funding model surviving for the next 10 years?
BBC will always be funded publicly. BBC in Britain is like the monarchy. It's part of our culture. It's part of our heritage. It will be always part of the public sector, publicly funded. We need that for many reasons, but the question is, in last 20 years, I go back as 25 years, the left of politics has taken over, and it started in 1990s when they took an anti-monarchy stance in 1990s, and also other institutions, instead of just concentrating on reporting the news, especially on politics. So it is now dominated by left of politics. It is not an allegation. You only have to look at it, the way they report the news. So that we need a balance. And I have to say, there is also an issue, people on the right of politics. They don't go into journalism. That's their fault also. So we need more people from right of politics to go into journalism.
It's interesting that you put the BBC as an institution alongside the monarchy there, another institution which has its issues at the moment as well. Babak Abemian, thank you so much for joining us as always. Thank you very much indeed. A fight over the BBC is ultimately a fight over who gets to define reality and whether truth can remain independent from power. As Britain debates reforming the BBC, media critics on the right argue the broadcaster is culturally biased and outdated, but still indispensable. The Economist calls for radical restructuring to protect its most valuable mission, trustworthy news. The Economist argues that while Trump's anger over a BBC documentary is legitimate, the political response risks destroying an institution that still delivers some of the world's most valuable journalism. At a time when streaming giants dominate entertainment and newspapers are shrinking into survival mode, the BBC remains a rare global source of verified reporting, The Economist says, and a critical counterweight to foreign propaganda efforts. But to regain public trust, the BBC, they say, must evolve. Critics demand less London-centric culture and more accountability for editorial missteps. The proposed solution: break off entertainment into a subscription-based model and secure protected funding to strengthen the news division, a sharper, more focused BBC built for a chaotic media age. And our next guest is Nora Lee Knudsen, who is a Republican, a commentator, and also based in London. Thank you very much. Welcome back to Q News. So this program where they edited Trump's speech from January the 6th, do you think that program, Panorama, crossed a journalistic line? And does that justify Trump's aggressive reaction?
I think everybody is shocked at what they did in regards to the edit in Panorama, because they created a lie in terms of what came out of President Trump's mouth. And as we know, this was deliberate. Not only did they splice language together to imply something entirely different than what Trump said, which was to go down there and cheer on the good senators, congressmen, and women, they also spliced in people walking to the Capitol in response to that, when in fact that footage was people arriving before Trump had even arrived to give his speech. So it is very deliberate behavior. And this not only happened 8 days before people were going to vote, it also has now come to light as a result of Donald Trump threatening to sue, that this happened as well in 2022. Now, I spoke to an American friend in London who told me she did not vote for Trump because of that. Everybody remembers that 12 seconds, I will go down there with you and we will fight like hell. Regardless of the impact of the election and him winning, it is not the job of the BBC to make up their own narrative of what he said by splicing different language together at different times during the speech. So I think everybody is applauding Trump for bringing them to task on that, for making them accountable, and to be the great organization that it used to be.
Yes, I think it's very hard to disagree with you that was not sloppy journalism and incredibly bad editing and to not make it clear that these two statements were an hour apart. And as you say, to put that footage in from before the rally was very, very bad journalism. It shouldn't have been done, shouldn't have been broadcast. But was the essence of what was said in that 12-second clip, the fact that he did say, we must fight, 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 and what ended up happening that day was indeed fighting at the Capitol, was the essence of the program, the broadcast, truthful?
Absolutely not. What he said about fighting was to fight the corruption, not to go into the White House and fight. So not only is it a lie, reckless, it's actually fraudulent. And what's even more concerning about the BBC is they have a verify service where they're supposed to verify the facts. That was not done. Even doubly concerning on top of that is that when this was brought to light by the leaked memo of Michael Prescott back in January, and in May, they chose to sweep it under the rug. So their process for trying to weed out their pervasive bias does not work. And they are so biased that they turn a blind eye to it. I think we cannot have faith in the BBC to report the news as it happens if they would allow this to happen for the elections of the leader of the free world. We've got elections coming up here in the UK in 2029. Do we trust the way they're going to be reporting what is said by leaders of the different parties here in the UK? All of that comes into question. And if it takes Donald Trump to hold them to task, to clean up the BBC so that they can go back to reporting the news without bias, then that will be a massive win for the BBC.
Well, critics like yourself would say that the BBC has this London worldview and is disconnected from the public. What would someone mean by that? What would you mean by that?
That it has a worldview and disconnected from the public? Is that the question?
Yeah, like a London worldview, a particularly left wing, I think that means worldview disconnected from the public. What would you think people mean by that? What would be examples of that kind of thing?
Well, when you say it has a worldview, there's nothing wrong with a presenter having a view, and that view may be, biased one way or another. The issue arises when you change the language of the president of the United States or somebody who's running for presidency. That's where the issue arises, and it's interference in a foreign nation's elections, which is highly illegal. So this is a real serious problem that the BBC thinks they're just going to sweep under the rug by sending an apology saying, oh, it was a lapse in misjudgment. No, this was deliberate. And Donald Trump, as we know, sued CBS $10 billion, then upped it to $20 billion when they did the same thing with Kamala Harris just before the elections. And CBS ultimately settled for $16 million. I think BBC is making a grave error by not taking this seriously, because more things will come to light. And everybody, yes, they want the BBC to survive, but they want it to be ethical and not to do anything that would be akin to what they just did that we found out in the Panorama interview and on the night news in 2022.
But of course, the difference, obviously, with an American company like CBS and the Kamala Harris 60 Minutes interview and the edit, they paid out. But it's widely believed that they would have won, had that gone to court, they would have won. But they decided to play out for political reasons because Trump can hurt them a lot.
Look, there's a lot of politics going on, of course, and for the UK, which is the biggest ally of the US, it's an absolute embarrassment. If you listen to the 45-minute interview Trump did last night with Bev Turner of GB News, he talked about how he loves the UK. He loves Scotland, where his mother is from. But it is shocking that Keir Starmer is not taking this more seriously, and the BBC is not taking this more seriously. I think people are going to demand change. The Royal Charter is up for review in 2027. And as a license payer for the BBC, I ask, why am I paying the license? Is I can't trust them to report what my president has said. And there are 350,000 Americans, more or less, living in England. So they would have influenced the perception. And that 12 seconds, and they claim just because it was 12 seconds, it doesn't matter. Well, that 12 seconds gets tweeted, gets spread on social media around the world. The BBC has 500 million viewers, and that has actually helped to divide the politics over Trump. It's actually seeded a lot of division. If you look back on that statement, that was in fact false.
And you say that he went on the BBC's right-wing rival, which I think he had said that people should watch GB News instead, the right-wing rival of the BBC in the UK. So he went on there to say that he loves Britain, he loves the British people, but he is asking the British people to take out of their pockets and your pocket, as someone who pays the license fee, $5 billion.
As we know, nobody's going to be paying $5 billion. This is Trump's way of making the point that it was reckless and putting their actions under the spotlight. This should not be happening in a democracy. We just had Remembrance Day celebrating all the brave people who lost their lives fighting for our democracy. And we would expect this out of maybe China, out of Russia, but not out of the United Kingdom, where they literally tried to create a different sentence out of Trump's lips. I mean, this is shocking. It is appalling. And I do hope that the BBC addresses this properly so that it never happens again. And should it happen, they weed it out immediately.
Well, indeed, I agree with much of what you're saying there. Now, of course, I'm playing a devil's advocate for the most part here. But when it comes to propaganda-driven media, and in the United States, for instance, you have Fox News, you have the other smaller stations now. Are they more reliable than someone like the BBC is?
I don't think it's about reliability. It's about accountability to report the facts and not splice language and imagery to convey the message of your bias. You can interpret what is said a certain way, but you must show what the leader said or what the person said when you are then expressing your opinion. So it's about accountability to present the news factually.
And can the BBC survive another scandal like this? And especially when it comes to the funding model. I asked the same question to Rebecca Memian earlier on about the fact that we have the streamers involved now. We've got Netflix and Amazon Prime and so on and so on. In a world where people are getting their news from TikTok and from social media, can the BBC keep surviving scandals like this, and its funding model particularly?
I think the BBC is a national treasure. 500 million people watch the BBC. They do some great programming. For example, The Night Manager is coming out in 2026. They have fabulous programming, but there's a real problem, and it is going to have to be weeded out, this pervasive bias that would lead to malicious, deliberate, fraudulent edits. That has to be weeded out. And Donald Trump, his lawsuit will force the issue.
Okay, well, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on and giving your views, as always. Nora Lee Knudsen, who is a Republican commentator based in London. Thank you so much once again. The future of media isn't just broadcasting, it's about defending democracy from distortion. But the BBC's internal struggle reflects a bigger global confrontation between journalism and political intimidation, between public service and ideological profit, between fact and fury. The world is watching to see which side wins. Thanks for watching In Focus, and stay tuned for more updates here on this media channel, Q News.